initiatives asking for more agency and political power for the people, and they met somewhere in the middle, creating this very specific configuration that can be called populist democracy. I will not ask you now what populist democracy is, because this is a harder question, but we will go back to that. Again, many conversations about populism and many definitions, so we will, it makes sense to unpack them, but we will do it a bit later. What is important here, that about like some body of literature on populism, and here I have Nadia Urbinati, for instance, she talks about populism as disfiguration of democracy. And even if we do not necessarily use the word disfiguration, what we have in mind that it is something like erosion of democratic institutions that builds on the assumption that we used to have a normal, proper democracy that was functional, and then it started like eroding, transforming into populism as its like simplified, distorted version. And political philosophers call this disfiguration. In Ukrainian case, proper consolidated democracy never was a reality. So interestingly, it functioned, it might look similar, it might have similar features, but it was not an erosion of democracy, but I call it a prefiguration of democracy. It was trying to bring more democracy in the political sphere in a very specific and intermittent way. Okay, so again, a bit of like theories. When we talk about the division of powers and accountability, which we have mentioned in the beginning, we can think about the institutional design, democratic checks and balances, right, the textbook example. But then we can think, and here I'm suggesting a Chimogluza and Robinson concept of the narrow corridor to democracy. They take a much broader pool of cases and much less Western-centric for that matter. And then they talk about society and political class making mutual checks on each other. Sort of two important agencies. So basically, you need a strong state and a strong society that to democracy be reproduced and maintained. So we over-focus on a strong state, on democratic institutions. For the first, like strong state does not necessarily deliver democracy, it can deliver something else. But it is as important to have a strong society that demands this accountability. And if any side goes weaker, then we have some distortions. And this framework is much more helpful in understanding and capturing what is happening in the post-Soviet region with fragile political regimes that have never arrived on the stage of consolidated democracy. And I'm leaving aside the question whether any state has arrived there fully, but keeping in mind, okay, like the Western model was not fully implemented there. Okay, and then we operate in this system of coordinates about these sort of mutual checks between societies and authorities. Then we can think about more diverse pool of agencies, more diverse set of political actors. Who is important here? Of course, the elites, authorities, political class, the people who are usually like political science focuses on, right? So political parties and different interest groups and so on. But then we can also think about civic activists, NGOs, and third sectors, so people who are not like doing politics professionally, but engage actively in what they perceive as the common good. And from this perspective, the first version of check and balances in the Ukrainian case, which was called competitive authoritarianism, as suggested by the Canadian political scientist Lucan Way, he called it pluralism by default. The society was weak and has no leverage and no capacity to demand accountability from authorities in the 1990s. However, due to layered historical legacies in Ukraine, it was regionally diverse and strong, and the center was weak. And again, we can discuss why it happened, because it was part of a bigger polity, and the political center was elsewhere. And the regional center was weakened intentionally by Moscow to prevent secessionist tendencies. So Kyiv was historically weak, and a lot of political and economic contacts were built directly from regional centers to Moscow, bypassing Kyiv. And then you can declare independence, but you cannot change structures overnight. So a lot of economic and political and social structures remained intact, and it took a while to modify that. So we have a polity which is structurally very specific, with strong regional powers whose interests do not necessarily go in the same direction. So what do? they influence each other. So we have this balance of power, we have this division of power. So when you usually hear about Ukrainian oligarchs, that is part of this story. You have strong regional clans that are trying to lobby their interests, that are trying to engage in politics and in economy. And in those weak setups, they are conflated. Those spheres are never like fully separated. So you have these like regional divisions and this pluralism by default, which created not, of course, a democracy, but an opportunity for more democratic engagement. Because how it happens, playing this Potemkin democracy, they were still trying to influence the electorate a certain way. And usually oligarchic centers of power, they have their media, and through media, they're trying to influence the electorate. And therefore, you do not have unanimity in media streaming. So you have diverse information flowing on media, and people have access to diverse information. And therefore, you have this pluralism that transforms in questioning and formulating a political interest and looking for certain parties of people who would represent in politics those interests. So the linkage is not that clear, but it worked this way, that regional power struggles through engagement with the electorate as the audience of the media created those windows of opportunities and provided access to diverse sources of information. Okay, that was the first one. The second one was the mass protests. Getting access to the information and seeing that the developments are not going in the right direction, eventually people took to the streets, asking for a change of a political regime. And then they started creating their parallel structures, how to deliver. If state is dysfunctional, then the civil society takes up on that. That was the second one, like historically the development. And then, of course, the populist, the most recent one, about this very specific connection between the leaders and the electorate. That's basically what I was just describing. So what I mean in this presentation by populist democracy, this is the notion which is hidden behind the bar. But basically, it operates beyond traditional institutions associated with the state, party politics, and representative democracy. It is institutionally weak, but media active and socially active. And paradoxically, not government, not high offices, but street politics and social media become very important political venues for these type of political struggles. And a lot when, like, to compensate for the weakness of institutions, a lot of precedental politics and ad hoc solutions are being developed. This type of politics is very personalized. So it's easy to see. If you look, we usually have a lot of competitors on any elections, presidential or parliamentary, and you have like dozens of different contenders. But in essence, they are very easily connected to specific people. And they diverge from each other, not by the political program, but by association to a specific charismatic leader. So you can clearly identify that this is like Tymoshenko bloc, Poroshenko bloc, this is Zelensky, and so on. So even if there is some name which was called like by Andrew Wilson, this virtual politics, when you have the Greens and the Conservatives and Social Democrats, they do not necessarily behave this way once they get elected. So they do not introduce those policies that would be aligned with the proclaimed ideology. Okay, so it's very personalized. It's more like competing with slogans and images and certain delivery, like media presentation, rather than the set of suggested policies. And therefore, it is very important, as I said, like social media is one of important venues. It used to be TV was much more important, but quite since, at least I would think like 10 years, social media definitely became very important for larger swathes of the population. And if we talk about populism, generally it is about disintermediation, because if it is like trying to diminish the role of institutions, so these are the pleas for direct connection and direct action. And another important constitutive feature would be emotional mobilization. So rather than what we think about as deliberative democracy, when we meet at the table and we discuss programs for the future development, here it's very much about like how to incentivize people to vote or to do something. And this is done very often through emotional mobilization. And this is relevant not only for the Ukrainian case, and if you think about populist parties that comes to your mind while I'm speaking, you would think that they usually operate largely through fear, sometimes anger, and much more rarely hope, because positive emotions have less potential for mobilization. They can also work, but negative emotions give much more immediate political capital. It's much easier to mobilize people through negative emotions. And there are plentiful examples like where the fear might be streamed, the blame, the guilt, the anger, but it's all there. And of course, it is anti-pluralist. It is constructing the polity as a unity. It's always majoritarian. It needs to provide an image that we against them, right? Rather than we are diverse and we have this like very nuanced, like orchestrating the polyphony, it's rather like being united as one. Democratization. So if we think like, why would I call it democracy? Why just not call it populism, right? Why do I need two words to mark this phenomenon? When we talked about democratization in the region, how can we sense this, what I call real democracy? That what qualifies that people do have, even if limited, but agency in the political sphere? If we claim that parties exist on paper, citizens are voters, but they do not necessarily have the full, like, complete power, and so on and so forth. So we can think about it sociologically, at least like empirically in the case of the post-Soviet sphere. When we look at regular sociological markers of development, people are asked, and usually when we have the erosion of democracy, it is always goes hand in hand with giving up on responsibility. So there is always like a favorite like question of sociologists: do you feel responsible for the developments in your country? Do you feel responsible for the developments in your country? I'm asking you now. That is a marker of democracy, because basically that's the understanding that if I am a democratic citizen, even if I'm not doing politics, but something depends on me. And there are certain ways to provide the political process with the input that is important for me. And learned helplessness, this is exactly the material that like moves the countries away from democratization. And interestingly, when we see like direct political markers for democracy, and we can of course measure the institutions and all of that, and political and human rights and so on and so forth, but sociologically it mirrors in the rise of positive feelings. When people start, so this kind of sense of personal responsibility, it brings engagement, optimism, and belief in democracy. Very often in the region, people are being asked, not only in the region, by the way, do you believe that you're living in democracy? Do you believe that democracy is a good thing? Do you think that your country is a democracy? These are like two different questions that like measure some different developments. Okay, and politically, basically what we were talking about, accountability and different ways to influence decision makers. Geopolitically, in the Ukrainian case, not only recognizing Ukraine as a democratic nation, I think you noticed that quite quickly after the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it was labeled as a fight of a democracy against an autocracy, right? It was also labeled as a colonial, a neo-colonial conquest and sort of the imperial revanchism and whatever. But one of major narratives was that it is like a fight of democracy against autocracy. Even if it is a rhetorical figure, but it still points to a certain direction of recognition, external recognition of a polity, that it does have some democratic component to it. And then very importantly, that since the last Maidan of 2014, NGO became a recognized speaker, like the NGO sphere. I mean, civic activists became recognized speakers internationally. So if you try looking who is on screens, so again, we have this narrative, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So who is invited on the Ukrainian part to participate in different discussions? The first question would be like, who is supposed to negotiate certain, like now we talk about the peace plan, and now the rendering of this plan and 28 points of this plan. And whom do we see there? And that would be very indicative, not for democracy, but like for patronal regime. I will talk about it in a second. So not necessarily the people whom you would expect, but in parallel, you have a very diverse pool of actors invited to different high offices and double checking and triangulating with them, which is a procedural recognition that there are diverse agencies at play. It's not like taking just like one person and convincing him. If it's one person, it's usually him. Does make sense what I'm trying to say, right? It seems fuzzy. It's not direct, but I'm sure that you have heard and read a lot about the direct markers. But those indirect ones are important because they capture something. And if we talk about erosion of democracy and the crisis and backsliding of democracy, suddenly it's much more important to find these subtle markers that point in one or the opposite direction. Because if we see the direct ones, it can be kind of yesterday's news, a bit too late. And again, Acemoglu and Robinson, I hope that you know this concept, so I will not be repeating it. So basically, it's about sort of democracy as not a constitutional fact, but as an ongoing challenge and a process where society and political class jointly co-constitute and reproduce it on a daily basis. And in the Ukrainian case, this process was enabled generationally and socially. So the first major factor was that new generations not socialized within the Soviet system started appearing, educated differently, and they were carrying like a different type of political culture, and they were demanding for different type of political configuration. And secondly, growing middle class. One of the drivers of mass protest, starting from Ukraine without Kuchma, then the Orange Revolution, and then the Revolution of Dignity, we had a series of mass protests in Ukraine, usually with regularity once per 10 years, a big one, and in between some small ones, which again testifies for the weak institutional design, because basically protesting is the only game in town to deliver certain political changes. However, the main drivers, if you try profiling the protesters and the power, like the interest and the social groups behind, very much was driven by middle class. So demographically, we see a specific like generational and educational marker, but also those are people who are integrated in international like networks, entrepreneurial, educational, cultural, and they demand sort of changing rules of the game. Okay, so taking all this in hand, I devised this concept for understanding the developments in Ukraine, trying to combine Acemoglu and Robinson and the concept of Hirschman of different like political strategies. So what you see, partly, but I hope you can still see. So the first one in the upper left corner is Potemkin democracy. Stephen Holmes, US political scientist, called Russian democracy, and by extension all regional democracies, because surprise, surprise, very often expertise is Russocentric on the region. And in the 1990s, for a good reason, by the way, but less so starting from 2000s. So Potemkin democracy is basically like window dressing as democracy. You want elections, here you go. How many contenders should be? Wonderful. Do you need division of, so like on paper it exists, but it never delivers. So you always have these double-sided effects of politics. And what is important, that the capacities, the competencies, the skills do not correspond with those that are constitutionally declared. So even if we think about like executive power, it's not consolidated where we would expect it to be. So not like the front lines sort of, the front stage institutions do not perform, they're just a decoration. And behind, there is an alternative institutional design of patronal networks, okay? So I called it playfully one. You know, Boxian, right? It's not the easiest one to pronounce. But I hope you get the hint what it refers to. So basically weak state, and not just weak, but weakened. It should be weak in order not to control on all the shadow deals, because it is about state capture and rent seeking. So taking all the national resources and exploiting them while still pretending that it is a democracy. And that is like this kind of structure is very well described in literature and well known. And basically people in essence have like very limited political power. They might be casting their vote, but it does not change the political regime. And it results in the exit strategy, political apathy. So it is a strategy of depoliticization. not political mobilization, but something like the opposite. So basically, don't care, live your life. And that's kind of the psychological contract. You know, the social contract, and there is a psychological contract, what is expected from different players in this game. So that was pretty much the situation in Ukraine, but then there was the Maidan protests, this request for direct action and what is called radical democracy, and this shackled Leviathan. And citizen disruptor willing to be citizen governor and claiming for voice, for claiming for political representation. How can you achieve this representation? Imagine, like, best case scenario, president is ousted, he left, really happened in the Ukrainian case. What do you do the next day? So you have dysfunctional institutions. You know that you cannot go to court because, like, certainly judges are the best qualified. Like, it's the most troublesome reform in Ukraine up till today because of very strong corporate solidarity, very good knowledge of law, how to prevent themselves from being fired, and sort of very reluctant from any changes. So the judicial branch is like a disaster. And then all the others, like, well-rounded concerns, let me put it this way. So what do you do? After you have celebrated it, you won. Wonderful, it is a manifestation of popular power, wonderful, but how do you live? How do you start your normal life from the day two? It's not an idle question, right? And I hope that we would not be facing this question, like, you know, in different settings, but it might happen. So it's a useful mental exercise. So what happened in the Ukrainian case? Compensating for the state, like creating parallel structures. How do you create those structures? Most recently with the war challenge, shortage of missile, shortage of information. If you remember the very first days of the invasion, there was the suspension of intelligence from the United States of America. It is on the table again. It is always like used as an argument, sort of as a bargaining chip, let's say. So what do you do? Crowdfunding to buy an artificial satellite, to get our own intelligence. Sound crazy, but that was like really happening in real life. So basically, civil society takes up more and more and more functions and creates networks in parallel with dysfunctional state institutions. Is it democracy? Not really. It's a very like weird, partly functional configuration. So the disruption was efficient, but it does not bring the change of the regime. And that is the problem. But it creates the experience of successful request for accountability, even if in a very like weird way. Okay. And then we have the third we have the third model, which is audience democracy. And here I'm taking the notion from Bernard Manin. And that is basically a populism. And that is trying to reconcile two models. So it turns out that political mobilization of broader masses cannot last long. And as you might imagine, civic activists is usually just like a fraction of the population. How many people do you believe tend to be regularly politically active and socially active in terms of volunteering, contributing? So like apart from their like main professional duties, actively engaging, not like from time to time, but like on a regular basis. Can you believe like the entire society can be mobilized? It can. It usually doesn't come from good circumstances, as the case of Ukraine shows. It can, but it doesn't last long. So it is like short-term mobilization can be on a big scale. Long-term, a very selected fraction of society, which becomes what we call professionalized civil society. If you start donating or doing something good, you engage in activism, but then it fades away. Research shows at least that this happens this way. So you have a fraction of society which is very much delivering and engaging in direct action. And then you have the majority that just wants the services to be provided to them. So what is happening as the result? Here is the trick of this double representation that I was mentioning in the title of this talk. Who represents the people? We have the majority of population that want the improvement of their life. Whom are they requesting to deliver to them? Who said in the beginning that democracy is about representation? So who represents in this case? So you have corrupt authorities and you have civil society. And in a way, authorities legally represent the society, and activists claim, NGOs claim to represent really. We are part of you. So we talk about direct representation, not like necessarily institutional representation, which is doubled. And that is the game which has been unfolding arguably up till today in Ukraine. Wartime democracy changed something, but again, it was just short term. I see the time runs, so I need to go forward quite quickly. I think the main point I made basically done. So Maidan mass uprisings was an attempt to build radical democracy, which turned out not functional in the long run. The elections of Zelensky, it was this use of social media for political effects and the establishment of audience democracy. How does accountability, how is it provided in the context of audience democracy? How do you hold your politicians accountable? What are the channels? What are the ways to request accountability? Yes. It's still very popular in the United States of America, so they are writing requests all the time to their representatives, and they expect it to do something, and that works. So that would be one way, yeah. Absolutely. That is exactly like how it is designed, like the entire system. So you are held accountable. If you do not deliver, then you are out of office. Sometimes you might even call for snap elections, right? So it depends on the legal configurations. What do social media change in this situation? If we talk about digital populism, do you understand what I'm asking about? Kind of social media, it's not just means of political communication. They change the essence of communication. And they replace, to a certain extent, efficiency with transparency. You have the illusion of being connected to your representative and that he's reporting to you, or they are reporting to you on a regular basis through their, like TikTok videos. Like, hey, hello people, like I'm planting trees here, and now I'm feeding homeless dogs or whatever, just like, and this, you've encountered something like that, right? And in certain system it operates. However funny it sounds, but that is the logic behind digital transformation of democracy, that you feel connected, that you feel that like politicians are facts of your everyday routine life, because they are somehow, they're always available. You open your smartphone and you can always access like, okay, what are they doing? Like Zelensky is reporting to me on a daily basis, like whom they met and how they discussed the plan. I have the illusion that I'm like constantly updated, and it's like, dozens of like messages like every day from his main channels, and and he speaks like saying, hey, the best people, like the brave people of the brave nation. Yes, it's me. Okay, wonderful. So that is kind of the psychological channel, how it operates. Okay. Now the effects of what I'm talking about. One of the markers that I have taught. When people are asked if they feel that things are developing in the right direction in the country, they tended to respond that no, hard no, or rather no, than yes. And you see this graph, right? So usually those who say that things are developing in the right direction were like something between like 13, 15%, you see the green line. And then you have three spikes of activism when people say, oh no, actually things are developing in the right direction. The first one would be around 2013, 14. which is the Maidan. The second one would be 2019, the election of Zelensky. The election of Zelensky coincided not only with the belief that things are moving in the right direction and the rising optimism about the future of the country, but also it converted in a positive customers' behavior. People started investing in their future. They started building, buying houses and sort of investing. So they started they were demonstrating with their actions their belief. And when they were asked if you believe things are going well, yes. Do you believe that we have a democracy? Yes. So these three factors show this spike of activism. And the last one, arguably the most counterintuitive, would be year 2022. You see a spike here from December 2021 to February 2022. Immediately after the beginning of the Russian full-scale invasion, people answer that things are moving in the right direction. It's not necessarily easy to unpack, but what does it tell you? Of course, they were not happy with the war. But these three types of what I call mobilization: popular mobilization, populist mobilization, and national mobilization. So to try to protect what we have. I will show you a little bit of other sociological data just to give some food for discussion. Level of support for democracy among Ukrainians has been rising steadily ever since mid-2000s. This is an interesting one because it puts it into the perspective. Two questions, the Gallup research. In different countries, when people were asked two questions. First one, do you believe that democracy is the best form of governance? And the second one, do you believe that actually popular will govern your country? And I circled with red Ukraine on both graphs. So Ukraine is the sixth among the pool of the countries to be so quite high to believe that democracy is the best form of governance. Where do you think Germany is? 5, is it more? It's 2023, it's not the freshest, so sometimes we do not have, we have just the most recent wave, but it's yet to be analyzed. Okay, so Ukraine, the sixth to believe that democracy is the best form of governance, and 11th to believe that popular will governs the country. So it's lower, but still good enough. It's still in the upper part of the table. Interestingly, for the German case, Germany is higher to believe that democracy is the best form of governance and much lower in believing that actually it is provided in the country, despite the robust international institutional design. We can talk about it. Of course, it's just it should be taken with a pinch of salt, but then it points in the direction that can be unpacked further. So I think I should be closing to the discussion. We should be ending at. No, I still have some 10 minutes probably, something like that. Okay. So what I was telling, back to this slide. 3 waves of mobilization, what I call popular mobilization, populist mobilization, and national mobilization. And each of them were connected to a very specific understanding of how politics should be arranged in the country. When we are talking about popular mobilization, that was the Maidan protests. When we were talking about populist mobilization, that was the audience democracy, the servant of the people. I watched the TV series, I know they will deliver. I've seen it already, the country will be. And the third one, oh no, we are attacked, actually we care about it. We used to criticize it, but now we appreciate it. So what you see is important that if you have peaks, that means that before them was a backslide. So the effect goes like that. You have mobilization, you have some new attempt to change the political landscape, and then you have the frustration with this inability to deliver. So basically it is a cyclical motion, but it does not go to ground zero point. So it still develops so it backslides to a certain point, but then it builds up on that. And it's like this reshuffling of the political domain. Okay. So we talked about that, and I will skip that. Yes, and probably I will just go closer to the most recent developments related to the war. So again, talking about optimistic, pessimistic, because I come here to enlarge your expertise with sociological data, because I believe that you have some expertise in political science. So I will provide you with the insights from the society. So when people were asked, again, in general, if they are optimistic or pessimistic, we already know that that was said, that was the manifestation of value of the country. But then, unprecedented, there was the spiking rise of confidence in state institutions. Again, what does it tell you? Let's recap it all together once again. During the Maidan, active civil society was building parallel quasi-institutions to deliver. The state is dysfunctional, creating something in parallel. And Ukraine remained one of the most distrustful societies in the world. The level of confidence in state institutions sometimes was one digit, 9, 11, 13% in different state institutions. And we're talking about courts, government, and so on. It's much lower even than the average in the region. I'm not even talking about broader perspective. In 2022, in the wake of the full-scale invasion, suddenly you have a spike of confidence in different institutions. Where do I have a slide? Okay, I have a lot of everything. No, here. Do you see the numbers? So this would be 2023, the end of 2023. Let's look, for instance, on the president. May 2022, the level of confidence in the president, 91%, unprecedented. Then it goes a bit down, 76, but still very high. But if you look at something else, the parliament, 58, way more than usual. And then it quickly backslides. Government, 74, 39. Local government remains sort of somewhere in the middle. So there was this like spike of confidence, and then it goes down, but not exactly to the pre-war level. But what are the most trusted institutions on top of this theme? Armed forces of Ukraine, protecting the country. And this remains the most trusted up till today institution. 98, 95, 97, 96%, so something around those figures by different estimates and different polling agencies. And then the second one would be volunteers. Why? And how it is related to the story that I'm trying to deliver to you. So we have a very diverse design, how power is distributed and how legitimacy is distributed, right? And we have partly functional institutions that are compensated by something else. So why volunteers are so much trusted?
Because they are the people. They was directly represent the people, help the people, because it's your neighbors, your friends, your family.
That's a different story. This is like, it's good that you mentioned it because it's here. When you ask like whom you trust and whom can you rely on, and who causes some good feelings in you, 30% say family, relatives, and loved ones. So personal trust still beats any type of institutional trust. People rely on close ones. And not only family ties, but also like weak social connections, like someone that we know, it worked efficiently well, like in in dealing and coping with different challenges. Yes, but volunteers is not just like something like, it's not just being one of us.
It's an armed NGO.
Sorry?
It's the civil society under arms. An NGO with arms.
Well, no, that would be volunteer battalions. And they're no longer existent because they were integrated in the structure of the armed forces of Ukraine. But when they were the volunteer battalions, they also had a very high level of trust, higher than armed forces of Ukraine. So if one of us takes the arms, then somehow I trust them more. So this sort of distrust to institution, it interestingly projects on different developments. So volunteers are those who provide for the army. Yeah, so they are with the arms, but not like standing with the arms, but like delivering the arms. So the army protects us and volunteers delivers. Although, if we look at the figures and statistics, the state provides much more, but it's not visible. So we are not talking about the objective situation on the ground, but of the perception of the people, that they trust volunteers more. And this is, for me, again, taps into this problem of double representation. So whom do we trust? State institutions? Do we trust the president? Do we trust the prime minister? Do we trust them as people, or do we trust them as institutions? If we look, this ambiguity very interestingly plays in the case of Zelensky, because he is perceived domestically as president who does not necessarily deliver what he promised, but from the international perspective, he is perceived as the projection of Ukraine. And if he's offended after the scandal in the Oval Office, his level of support just like skyrocketed immediately. And even the most critical fractions of the society and most of those who are on the front line, they say, we did not vote for him, we did not support him, but this is not the way things should be done. So again, this kind of, so we understand that also the meaning of sociology is changing. And bad news, it's not only in Ukraine. So it's not like somehow like fixing the objective state of events, but it's always like a public declaration. When I'm being asked, I think what it means and what my question might mean, right? So this kind of double-sidedness. So when we look at those sociological polls, we should like keep in mind this double representation. What like people feel that they're represented by political parties, by state institutions, but also by civil society. And it's like something like one of us, but not quite, because I'm sitting at home and like scrolling through like social media. I'm not there, but I feel this sort of like what Urbinati calls direct representation. I feel directly represented. So the distance of representation is minimal. It's not mediated by other institutions. You wanted to add something? Yes?
Can you give us a hint what the last two actors mean in this diagram? So Teleton on the bottom of this media, something?
Yes. So since 2022, there was a decision to introduce this all-national marathon when all major TV channels united together and they were all streaming the same. And first it was presented as a sort of collaborative endeavor, that it's no longer about like slicing the audience who has the better like air and so on, but sort of joining the forces to cover the situation, because with power outages and everything, it was not a given, right? But quite soon, the level of trust in telethon, it is called, but basically this TV marathon, it just like deteriorated because it was perceived as sort of as a censorship, as a channel for censorship. So in the beginning, it was perceived as a means for consolidation, and this is a reliable kind of source of information, but then it was perceived. So this democracy by default, again, like going back, division of powers, even here. So this sort of trying to prevent any monopolization, even if media is not like necessarily about political power, but it is a channel that influences the audience, that makes political choices, and therefore it becomes in a way part of like quasi-political capital. So that was telephone. Yes, and what was the second one you asked? The Komnarada is the parliament.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Another interesting case. The question is, talking about reconstruction, who should fund the reconstruction? So imagine the best case scenario, the war ends, a lot of ruins, a lot of investment and funding should go into the country. So where the money should come from? what is the conditionality behind? So who should invest in reconstructing the country? And the second question, who should oversee and guide this process? So maybe you do not see from where you sit, so it would be even more curious to have your well-informed guesses. So who pays and who controls? If we think about the reconstruction of Ukraine, and we're asking Ukraine, and we are not asking people in Davos or whatever. So we're going to the people and ask, like,
I think that Putin should pay for operations and all that stuff, and probably that the Ukrainian government oversees that this is happening, and maybe together with international governments. Right now, they're also discussing everything together, so close by to them as well.
In terms of the supervising, I don't think that genuinely doesn't put support for the government on that bias, and the Ukrainians would want some more control for like NGOs or like civil organizations which are currently already involved. Maybe they put them in that.
so basically we have the right answer, just like blend the two. So the first one was easy. Russians, not only reparations, but also frozen assets, which is a point of contention today because a lot of Russian assets are in certain places frozen and that could be used for that matter. And Ukrainians are certainly on that side. But asking who should control, definitely not the government, distrusted. So here we see these like indirect questions about like trust and political representation. So it should be NGOs together with international institutions. So trusting foreigners more than your own institutions. Okay, it also tells a story, right? And these I find also, now the figures are slightly different. I will show you in the next slide. But at the end of 2024, there was like asking about the ratings of different public figures and politicians. If the elections are held next Sunday, whom you would vote for? And then you see that the incumbent is not on top, but he still has very like tentatively solid support, especially if you compare him with the previous presidents of Ukraine. So the top one, the top two would be again people related to armed forces. Interestingly, the rating of Valeriya Zaluzhny, who is not in charge for quite a while now, and he's an ambassador of Ukraine in the UK, he still keeps the high rating, although he's not present in the political domain. So he's still associated with this like successful counteroffensive, but generally his image in the populist democracy. So it's not only about delivering, but also it's about projecting a certain image. So his rating still stands high. Then we have Kirill Budanov, the intelligence head. But you see the red line, exactly the same rating of the most known volunteer and the incumbent president. So we have, you see the third and the fourth position. You have Volodymyr Zelensky and Serhiy Prytula. Serhiy Prytula was the one who crowdfunded for the satellite. So like really big things for the army purposes were provided. So for me, this exemplifies again this dilemma of double representation. That people who are doing very different things, but somehow for a very political question, whom we would vote for to be a president, they have exactly the same ratings. 2024 now, it's a bit different, but still the tendency is quite there. Again, the other polling station, but more or less the same. Just like to give you an example, the level of trust in political parties, the bottom line. If you see the figure 72% almost, that's the level of distrust. And what we usually have in the Ukrainian case, we measure the difference. And we have a lot of constituencies with negative rating. Yeah, and that applies for political parties. Yes, and that's the most recent ones. And I'm coming to the conclusions because I think that's the high time for Q&A. So, as of now, we have competing democratic models and the situation of absent elections and absent formal political process, because by the martial law since 2022, and it's almost 4 years now, no active political process is there. How accountability and representation is guaranteed? Because we know that monopolization of power, it is provided structurally, but also temporarily. If one person holds power for a very long time, maybe this is not like the country to speak about that, but it's a different constitutional arrangement, but usually we need the change of people in offices. And if we talk about Ukraine, almost every presidential elections, we bring a new person in the high office. With one example, and this was like rigged elections, okay? So how accountability is provided? Through pressure. So how it is done? If we think about the model of audience democracy, very often you would not believe how many policies were backtracked when they caused negative reactions of social media. So certain innovations, certain law, certain actions, certain policies are sort of like leaked and then checking the reaction. If there is silence, they are implemented. If there is a spike of reaction in social media, they are backtracked. So this is how audience democracy operates. And the second model, the radical democracy, exerted pressure from the civil society. Even given the martial law, investigative journalism keeps going, and all the corrupt cases are being investigated, and they are also publicized. So a lot of happening in this domain, and quite recently it also made it to the global attention. And again, the model of the Maidan was enacted. The so-called cardboard Maidan in July 2025, just something like half a year roughly ago, with young people coming to protest again the destruction of anti-corruption bodies. So all those models that I described, so we have like radical democracy, this like protest, and it worked again to a certain extent, right? But then we have a number of scandals. So when we say it worked, it doesn't mean that it was aborted completely, but it means that the political system rearranges, trying to modify and to do something like to do better next time, not to cause such a reaction. So we have these dueling models in real life when we have the civic activism as a sort of this model of like direct representation, but very like civic activist model of engagement. Then we have this delegatory model in the audience democracy and these like mass protests that are used if the situation like goes completely off hands. A lot of questions and still quite problematic appropriation of the state, which is the precondition for building working institutions. And I would say that it's still, the jury is still out, whether it is a disfiguration, a prefiguration of democracy, but at least political developments are there, even given the very hard context of the war and a lot of population simply being excluded from the public sphere because part of them are abroad, being like refugees under temporary protection, you know, that millions and many of them in Germany, by the way, and some of the people are on the front line also busy with something else like defending the country, not participating in that. But given all that, still there is certain political life which is like under radar, but trying to provide accountability. And indeed, we all know, rallying around the flag, the war context creates perfect conditions for monopolization of power. And of course, it has been unfolding in Ukraine as well. The military administration, in a way, curtailed and backtracked the decentralization reform, but the civil society trying to prevent the abuses of power in those cases. So this is in short the dramaturgy, I would say, not necessarily the drama of Ukrainian politics. Thank you for your attention.